If you have a Bible and you like to follow along, please turn in it to 2 Kings chapter 18. This is where we'll spend our time. You know, one of the problems, I guess it's a problem, maybe not, with sermonizing is you don't ever know what all the needs are in the room. And some people come in, they're happy. Some people come in brokenhearted. Some people come in worried. You just never know. And so every sermon then has to do a lot of things all at once. So with that in mind, it seems to me, I'll just say it that way, it seems to me, there are impediments that we all face with regard to our devotion to God. We talked about some of them in the Sunday school class today. The fact that most of the time we know what the right thing to do is. We know how to be better people, but that we fail, and we do. Another aspect of that is that keeps us from being able to come to Jesus and to receive the help that we might receive otherwise is we're human beings that like to think ourselves competent in most arenas. I heard a Christian philosopher say, he did a great talk, it's a beautiful talk, on Jesus, the smartest man that ever lived. And the premise of the talk was, why don't we invite the Lord into the common places of our life? Let's say we're a plumber. Wouldn't we think that Jesus would know the most about plumbing of any person who's ever been on the planet? Would he not be competent in that field? I'd say he would be. But we like to think ourselves competent. And I can't tell you how many non-believers I correspond with for whom that is the impediment to belief. That there has to be this bent knee where we come to God and say, we're not able, you're right, and we're wrong. And they just can't do that. And the other place that makes it hard for you and me as believers is we can be deceived. So with all that in mind, I know that's a lot, let's look at the text. 2 Kings chapter 18 verse 1. In the third year of the reign of Israel's king Hoshea, who the son of Elah, Ahaz's son Hezekiah, became king over Judah. He was 25 years old when he began to reign. And he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah. He did what the Lord approved, just as his ancestor David had done. Hezekiah eliminated all the high places. He smashed the sacred pagan pillars to bits. He cut down the Asherah poles. He demolished the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for up to that time the Israelites had been offering incense to it. The serpent was called Nehushtan, which means a thing of brass. He trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel. In this regard, there was none like King Hezekiah among the kings of Judah, either before or after him. He was loyal to the Lord. He didn't abandon the Lord. He obeyed the commandments that the Lord had given to Moses. The Lord was with Hezekiah. Hezekiah succeeded in all of his endeavors. He rebelled against the king of Assyria and refused to submit to the king of Assyria. He defeated the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory, from the watchtower to the city fortress. And in the 4th year of King Hezekiah's reign, it was the 7th year of the reign of Israel's king Hoshea, the son of Elah, King Shalmaneser of Assyria marched up against Samaria and besieged it. After 3 years, Shalmaneser captured Samaria in the 6th year of Hezekiah's reign. In the 9th year of King Hoshea's reign over Israel, Samaria was captured. The king of Assyria deported the people of Israel to Assyria. He settled them in Halah along the river Gozan, and in the city of the Medes. This happened because the people in Israel did not obey the Lord their God, broke their agreement with God. They didn't pay attention and obey all that Moses, the Lord's servant, had commanded. And in the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, King Sennacherib of Assyria marched up against all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. Now, the backstory to this is gigantic, and I could spend the entire 20 minutes just going through the backstory. I would encourage you to read it. But essentially what's going on here, when it says Israel, it's talking about the northern 10 tribes. The kingdom's divided. You've got Judah and Benjamin to the south. You've got the other 10 tribes to the north. and the kingdom is completely divided. So when it says that the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, captured Samaria, that's the northern kingdom's capital. Mount Gerizim is where the Samaritan temple is, and all of that is entailed there. So the king of Assyria has overrun the northern kingdom. He's deported a lot of the people in the northern kingdom to Assyria. A lot of Assyrians have come back to live in the northern kingdom, and this is the place where the kingdom became divided to such a degree that the people in Judah hated the people in Samaria. That's why Jesus is standing at the well, and the Samaritan woman comes up to him. She says, "Why are you, a Jew, talking to me, a Samaritan?" The reason she asks that question is because of this history. This is 720 or so BC, and it is still a problem for them by the time that Jesus walks the earth. But there's this beautiful passage to me here in that Hezekiah is like no other king of Judah before him and no other king after him, and that includes all of them. People in today's modern Judaism look at David as the greatest king of all. They're wrong. The Bible says they're wrong. Not me. I like Hezekiah. He's my favorite king, but the Bible even agrees. Well, how about that? The Bible agrees with me. How about that? That King Hezekiah is the greatest king they've ever had. What is it that makes him a great king? Is it his military prowess? No. Is it his grand leadership qualities? No. Is it that he was particularly good looking? No. It's none of those things. The only thing that matters, biblically speaking, is he obeyed the Lord fully in everything throughout his life. Didn't say that he didn't do wrong things. He did. He made some mistakes, but they were innocent mistakes. They weren't mistakes of malice where he wanted something for himself and did something in order to aggrandize himself. What is it that makes him so distinctive? It's that he believes God like a child. That is the distinction in Hezekiah. Now, one thing about children that is absolutely true is you do not have to teach a child to trust. They just will. You can teach them not to trust. You surely can do that. Trust is just intrinsic to the small child. They will trust an adult implicitly, but you can destroy that trust just as well. I have a friend who grew up in a household where the backstory here is incredible. The father was raised in a family where there was a divorce when he was 10. And at 13, the stepfather disliked him so much as a child in the house that he made him live in the tool shed. He wouldn't allow him in the house at all. He was kicked out of the house. He lived in the tool shed. He would not allow his mother, the child's mother, to buy clothing for him. So he had two other sisters, so he had to wear his sister's hand-me-downs to school. That's how much the stepfather disliked him. No reason why. Just one of those crazy things that happens in this situation. He grew up like that, fully abused. But when he became an adult, he became a follower of Jesus, and he made up his mind, I am not going to be like my father was to my children. And he was a great father. This friend of mine, if you ever met this friend of mine and talked to him very long about his life, you'd hear story after story of how, I just marvel. I say, man, I wish I'd have had a father like that, who knew which battles to fight and which battles to not fight, who knew which things to crush in his son and which things to encourage, and did it with the kind of tenderness that just is like God. And this guy for sure has no problem trusting God today because of this upbringing that he had. In other words, the trust that he had in his father was not crushed. Therefore, for him, trusting God is no problem. Pretty fragile when we think about it in terms of raising children. But why is that childlikeness so difficult for us today? I think there are lots of reasons for it. I think one of them is that every person in this room, I would say, I could be wrong about that, but I'm guessing that every person on the planet has something within them that has been broken. And it is broken so badly that they cannot release it. And the brokenness still applies to them in terms of their walk with the Lord today. I know that's the case for me. I'm going to say it's the case for every person who calls the name of Jesus. I don't think we ever get past that. So think about it like this for a moment. If you think that maybe this isn't true, I just want to offer this to you to think about. If we think that it's not true, that there are things in us that are so broken that we can't get past them, don't raise your hand, but just think about this for yourselves. When you pray to God, do you pray with the thought in the back of your head, God probably won't do this anyway? Just think about that for a minute. I'm going to pray, but am I thinking in the back of my head that I'm going to be disappointed? That comes from somewhere, doesn't it? That's not something that a small child would think, right? But we learn it. And as time goes on, as we learn more as adults and become more and more fragmented and damaged, we come to the place where it's really hard to trust God fully in that way. Now, I'm going to say be of good cheer, because if we're ever confronted in a moment where we have no resources left to ourselves, I am confident God will show up. That I believe. But in the meantime, it's hard because we have had that sense of safety. Children learn to trust, and they maintain that trust because they are safe and they know it. That safety kind of gets dented as we grow older and older. Now, if Jesus were to walk in this room right now, here we are sitting here, we're all fairly well fed and everything's going okay, and he says, do you trust me ultimately with your life? I guarantee you we would all nod our heads, yes we do, absolutely we do. But that trust is so easily shaken, isn't it? So easily shaken. Let me relate a story to you. I don't know what this story, it impacted me, so I'm going to share it with you. Maybe it doesn't impact anybody but me, but that's okay. There's a man by the name of Christopher Carrier that I read about several years ago. And he, as a small boy, he was raised in a home, a believing home. His father was a believer, his mother was a believer. They were churchgoers. Everything about their lives was fairly idyllic as far as being raised up in a middle-class home in this country. And his father operated a factory wherein they made fabrics. And the father had about 40, 50 employees. And one of the employees consistently showed up to the job drunk. Now, the father put up with it a long time because, you know, this is this person's livelihood. You don't want to take it away from them unless you just absolutely have to. But finally, it became a danger to the other people around the man working when he's drunk. So the father had to let the man go. Well, the man was really upset about that, as you might imagine. And he thought to himself, I wonder how I could take this out on the guy that fired me. So what did he do? He disguised himself and he abducted the man's 10-year-old son. Took the son out in the woods, shot him in the temple, stabbed him, and threw him in a ditch and left him for dead. The son didn't know who'd done it. The man never was caught. Nobody ever solved this crime. Well, somehow, somebody found Christopher Carrier in the ditch, and he was alive, and they got him to the hospital, and he recovered. The only suffering he had in terms of permanent damage was he was blinded in the eye where the bullet had gone through his temple. He went to a youth group at 15. He became a Christian. And he decided once he became a Christian that he was going to devote his life to following Jesus as best he could, which he did. Grew up, started a family. Well, it bothered him that the man, he didn't know who'd done it to him. So he started searching, and he searched back through his father's records to find out the man that was fired. Now, how he came to this, I do not know. But sure enough, he found the man who was fired, and he found out the man was 77 years old and living in a nursing home in another state. So he drove there and met the man and asked the man about the incident, and the man confessed to him. The man's name was David McAllister. He said, yes, I did that. I'm so sorry I did it. I was wrong. I was an alcoholic. I should have not done it. Please forgive me for all this. And they began to have a relationship. So Christopher Carrier started bringing his family to meet with David McAllister. And through that, David McAllister became born again after what he'd done. You know, sometimes God has to allow somebody to be very much wounded in order that they then can bring healing to somebody else. Because now you can't say, you've never been through what I've been through, right? There's an understanding there. Think about it in terms of biblical characters. You got Elijah, another great character in the Bible. Elijah, you remember Mount Carmel and the prophets of Baal, one of those great Christian biblical stories that we all think about. Maybe we all do. I do. I think about it from time to time. But anyway, I'm thinking about it today. But he was challenged, and he offered a challenge to the prophets of Baal. And he said, look, if Baal is God, then you're going to pray to your God, and he's going to consume the altar. The God that answers by fire, he is the Lord. And so the prophets of Baal danced around the altar for 12 hours, cut themselves, whipped themselves, did everything possible to get Baal to answer their prayer. Of course, they were praying to no one, but that didn't matter to them. They really thought, well, Baal didn't answer. Then Elijah walks out and just says, Lord, hear me. And the fire of heaven comes down and consumes the altar, laps up all the water, kills all the prophets of Baal. But then Elijah immediately in the text, what does he do? He flees to hide in a cave. Now, who would hide from anybody after you'd prayed and had God do something like that? But Elijah does hide. Why? He's afraid of Jezebel. He goes and hides. This is the piece of this that I hope would encourage all of us to trust God more. And that is this: God does not punish despair. You know, when we pray for things and we seem to see that God doesn't answer a prayer in the way that we think he ought. And we have despair over that fact. I can say I've been there. God doesn't punish despair. He may use it to bring us to a place of usefulness, but he also may use it to change us in some way. You see, this all boils down to one thing, and this goes back to Hezekiah. Hezekiah, like a small child, simply trusted that God would do what God said. And he didn't question it. He just trusted him. For me, I look at this and I think, oh, if only I could live in that kind of freedom 24/7. Just absolutely abandoned to the fact that God is with me and that I can trust him with everything and that I don't have to worry about anything. Jesus said it himself, right? Don't worry about anything. Don't be anxious for the things you can't control. I wish I could do that. I want to do that. But you see, there's a sense in which all of us have this impediment that says, I can do stuff on my own. I'm up to the task. There's a scientist by the name of James Tour. You may not know who this is. I would encourage you to go to YouTube if you ever get a crack at it and look up James Tour and listen to him speak. He is one of the greatest synthetic chemists on earth. He has hundreds of patents. And in those hundreds of patents, he has started a dozen multi-million-dollar companies utilizing the chemical patents that he has. And if anybody had self-assurance, you would think a person like that was, but if you hear him speak, he talks about his relationship to Jesus in a way that is, and I'll just say it for the way it strikes me sometimes, almost embarrassing. It is so childlike and so pure and so effusive that it's almost uncomfortable to listen to him talk about how much he loves the Lord. I remember when I was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, I got involved in watching the Eagles, the football team out of Philadelphia. I didn't care anything about the NFL, and then all of a sudden I got to know a few of the players and started to learn about their lives, and the next thing you know, every Sunday I'm glued to the TV if there's a local game that I can watch. The quarterback was Randall Cunningham, who I thought was still do think, one of the greatest quarterbacks in terms of talent that's ever been. He got traded to the Vikings, where he had a real coach. And they were one field goal away from going to the Super Bowl. I'll never forget it. And playing Atlanta, by the way. One field goal. A few seconds on the clock. It was not a long field goal. It was like 38 yards. The field goal kicker had not missed a single field goal the entire year, not one. So here we are, you just figure, okay, we're going to the Super Bowl. And what was so fascinating to me, Randall Cunningham, while he was in Philadelphia, because of guess who? Herschel Walker had become a Christian. He and his wife. They showed a picture of Gary Anderson, the kicker, going out on the field, and Randall Cunningham got down on his knees and then laid down on his face on the sideline, praying that God would, of course, praying that God would allow the field goal to go through and they'd go to the Super Bowl. Randall Cunningham never went to a Super Bowl, which tells you what happened with the field goal. The only field goal he missed all year was that one. Randall Cunningham got up. The interviewers came to him later and said, you know, what were you doing? He said, I was praying that God would allow us to have the field goal. They said, well, he missed. Randall Cunningham said, yeah, well, somebody had to win the game, right? And he went on with his life undeterred by the fact that God had not answered that prayer in the way that Cunningham wanted God to answer the prayer. In other words, he was so devoted to God and had such a childlike faith that he said it. He said, I just trust God that God didn't want us to go to the Super Bowl, and that's okay with me. That was the last game he played. He retired and went on with his life. A lot of people look at us as followers of Jesus. And I remember, this is what struck me about that story. I didn't finish it. A friend of mine in the church who was a follower of Jesus, a real devoted Christian, came to me and said, I thought that was so embarrassing that he should lay down on the field and pray like that. He shouldn't do that. I thought, why not? What a declaration to the world that I trust God here. That was what he was doing. But my friend who was a Christian found it so unsophisticated that he was embarrassed by it. See, that's the thing about Hezekiah. If you read the account of Hezekiah, you can read it in Isaiah, you can read it in 2 Kings, you can read it in Chronicles, you'll see that there was a point at which the Assyrians came to Jerusalem when they laid siege to it, and they were on the wall. And they said, why are you trusting Hezekiah? Hezekiah's not going to be able to deliver you, nor will Hezekiah's God. Look at all the other gods that we Assyrians have already overrun, speaking of all the pagan people that they had overrun. Why do you think God's going to deliver you? So you can see what's being said. You're a fool for trusting God this way. And Hezekiah is a fool for trusting God this way. But what happened? The Assyrians were defeated, miraculously defeated. It feels primitive to people that you and I would trust God. It feels primitive and unsophisticated to people that we would declare our trust in God. And I'll say for us, in some ways, it's a little tough for us too, to trust him like Hezekiah trusted him. And then the last feature of this is we can be deceived. I don't know how many of you like the Twilight Zone. I love the Twilight Zone. The music was, I can't forget the theme song, but anyway, all the effects were so cheesy and, everything was plastic masks and everything else. But the stories were really good. And I wonder if Rod Serling was a believer because of this one episode. Here's how it went. This American was on a walking tour through Europe, just traveling through Europe. And he gets caught in a terrible thunderstorm, and he comes up on this building that's all stone and mossy, and he knocks on the door because he's trying to get out of this thunderstorm. It's pouring rain, lightning snapping and popping, and the person opens the door, and it's a monk. He's come to a monastery, and the monk invites him in, come in out of the weather, puts him up by a fire, gives him something to eat and drink, takes care of him. And while the man is in the room, he's looking around this nice room where the monk's going to put him up, and he notices a door over here. It's a pair of doors stuck together, and they've got these looped handles, and there's a kind of a cane stuck through the handles. And so the man says, what's the story here on this door? He said, well, that's where we have someone of great danger locked up. And the man says, well, what are you talking about? He said, Satan's in there. We've locked up Satan behind that door. And the man, the American, you could tell for him this sounds unsophisticated and stupid and foolish. So the monk leaves the room. And the man goes, and on this door, there's a little slide door, and he looks in there, and here's this nice-looking guy standing in there, just dressed nicely, got a sweater, a cardigan, and they start to talk. And the man says, what are you doing in there? And the guy says, that crazy monk, he's locked me up in here. The monk's insane. And the American thinks, looking at you, I guess he is insane. This is such a nice-looking fella behind the door. Crazy monk. Why don't I just pull the staff out and let him go? He pulls the staff out. The doors come open. The man walks into the room and turns into this hideous demon and then disappears in a puff of smoke. So the monk comes in and says, what's going on? The American says, I opened the door and let him out. And the American then says, I didn't recognize him. I didn't recognize him. And the monk says, that's humanity's greatest weakness. That's Satan's greatest strength, that we don't recognize him. How do you defeat that? How do you not become deceived? Just be like Hezekiah, like a little kid. Just trusts God with everything. No matter what life brings, trust God. Because, as Peter says, cast all our cares upon him, but because he cares for us. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me,